Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing the breaking news story that has come out of Syria. The United States has carried out airstrikes in Syria against what it has called an Iran-backed militia on a base, I believe, called the Imam Ali base or something along those lines. What does this mean, of course, for U.S. involvement in Syria? Is this, as the U.S. says, in response to rocket attacks on its bases and otherwise in its interests, of course, across the region? That is, of course, something that we will talk about in this show. But even beyond that, there's quite a bit of news that is connected to Syria that's been happening in the past number of days. The Iraqi foreign minister has called for Syria to return to the Arab League. This is a demand that Iraq has made a number of times over the years, saying that Syria is an Arab issue and that the Arabs must resolve this issue amongst themselves instead of having external actors involved in that. We've also had a German court quite significantly sentencing of former Syrian intelligence officers to 4.5 years in jail for complicity in crimes against humanity. On top of that, then we also have, on the part of the rest of the world, especially just out of the UK, a poll showing that there's a bit of apathy now occurring on the part of Britons, for example, where the number of people who know about the Syria war and where it is currently standing has gone down drastically in these number of years. And one would imagine that that would be the case for much of the rest of the world, as the rest of us have been distracted with other issues as well. Let's discuss all of those issues, if we can, a bit further with our panelists who are joining us this morning. Joining us from Detroit, Michigan is Dr. Saeed Khan, who is a senior lecturer in Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University. Joining us from Holliston, Massachusetts is Frank Sobchak, who is a retired colonel. He's also a PhD candidate in international relations at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Frank and Saeed, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us. Frank, let me start with you. Let's firstly talk about the strike on the Iran-backed militia. What do you make of it?
So, yeah, I think it is in response, at least as the Defense Department has indicated, to attacks that they claim were carried out by Kataib Hezbollah as well as Kataib Imam Shuhada, two organizations that there's been kind of a series of kind of strikes going back and forth. In recent months, there have been 3 attacks, one in Erbil airport, one at Taji, and then one at the Green Zone, usually rocket attacks. And this kind of matches the kind of attack modus operandi of many of these groups. And the combat kind of between the United States and Hezbollah goes all the way back through the entire Iraq war. So it's kind of a long series of fights and conflicts that they've kind of tit for tat gone back and forth. One of which included the airstrike against Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis in January 2020. So it's really been a long series of kind of conflict.
Saeed, we know the context of why this may have occurred, but then there is the whole other issue of, was this even legal or not, right? I know there's a huge debate, pretty much just occurred immediately right after this was announced, that was the U.S. even allowed to carry out such a strike in another country?
Well, I mean, this is the ambiguity of international law, and particularly as it is carried out by large powers. There's a certain impunity by which many actors will essentially violate the sovereignty of borders. The Middle East, unfortunately, has been privy to this for not just years and decades, but perhaps centuries. And clearly here, the United States was not invited into Syria. The relations between Washington and Damascus are quite bad. But that, of course, doesn't impede countries like the United States or other actors in the region, particularly over the last 10 years, where the troubles, if you will, in Syria have escalated in the way that they have.
Yeah, so, there's a lot to talk about, of course, when it comes to Syria-U.S. relations, right, Frank? But the elephant in the room, as, of course, you alluded to as well, is Iran and or Iran-backed militias, if we may call them that. Does this sort of strike help in any regard? Because we also have the huge context of the Syria, actually there's 2 contexts here. There's the Syria crisis being unresolved altogether, and Damascus not really appreciating the U.S. presence at all on its soil, even in areas where it has natural resources such as oil and gas. And then B, the whole effort by the U.S. to apparently re-enter at some level the Iran nuclear deal.
It's for sure. It's very much a difficult situation, and the U.S. is really kind of in between, the proverbial rock and a hard spot, because on one end, the Biden administration has been very clear that it wants to restart the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear talks in some manner, whether it be a complete restart of the same agreement or a modification of the agreement. They're really they desire to undo the shutdown that the Trump administration did of the JCPOA. But at the same time, there's concern that if attacks on U.S. forces or other coalition forces in Iraq kind of go unanswered, then that could potentially result in further attacks, which would itself imperil the desire to get the JCPOA re-going. So it's really kind of a tough spot.
Let's then also talk about, considering we're talking about the international community, its involvement in Syria, let's talk about the German court and what it's done vis-a-vis this the Syrian intelligence officer. This is being hailed as the first step towards accountability in Syria, holding Bashar al-Assad accountable, et cetera, et cetera. Is this to be celebrated? I mean, I would imagine that there are a lot of people out there who would be very nervous about other countries getting involved and charging their respective officials, X or otherwise?
And I mean, when you have, of course, extradition from certain countries, that's going to then affect whether people from those countries that are affected will even travel abroad. There are enough international warrants out against various officials from countries, which then makes them think twice about where they travel. But I think we have to look at this conflict in concentric circles. Clearly, there's an appetite by many in the international community to hold Syria accountable. And you have, in examples as what happened in Germany, a relatively low-hanging fruit. It doesn't mean that any of the European countries have to then encumber themselves with further penetration into Syria, either through the use of the court system or even military intervention. And I think it's an important point to then recognize how much of the optics are involved here. Germany can claim a victory that it is adhering to international principles by holding those account who have been charged with crimes against humanity. And even here, when it comes to the United States, I think it's important to take this particular strike in Syria in context. One of the questions that always should be asked is who really is the audience here? Who is the United States trying to send a message to? It doesn't really seem to be that it's Iran from a standpoint of a bellicose relationship or a threat. If anything, it seems more likely that it's setting down a marker, telling Iran that this is the kind of proportionality, this is the way that the Biden administration is going to approach things, relatively far away from Iran itself. And see no contradiction between that and negotiation with the JCPOA. At the same time, it's also sending major messages to other countries in the international community, Russia and China, saying that we, the United States, are still in the Middle East, so do not write us off. It's not a full disengagement. And then also to many of America's regional allies. I think this is a message to Israel and particularly to Prime Minister Netanyahu that do not allow Syria to then become an excuse for his political issues. After all, he's up for re-election in April, and it has never really passed Prime Minister Netanyahu to exploit situations for his re-election.
So, Frank, I want to for a moment talk about the Arab League, right, and Iraq's wish for Syria to come back into the Arab League. And the reason I'm bringing this up right now is because it feels like, Iraq is, of course, it's remained consistent about this for a number of years now, that Syria should be allowed back in, and then Arabs should resolve this issue amongst themselves by somehow working it out, battling it out amongst themselves within these meetings. Do you think that that is actually what probably is the best strategy here? Because it feels like the more we have the international community involved, be it even the Iranians and Russians, I'm saying, by the way, including the Americans, that it just muddies the waters further. Like, we need this to be done on a very, very regional basis, concentrated efforts to resolve the situation in Syria, or for the near foreseeable future, we won't have a resolution.
So, I mean, I do always argue for a regional solution being the best option. However, kind of in this case, the crimes of the Assad regime have been so clearly documented and so clearly enumerated. The use of chemical weapons more than 300 times, both sarin nerve gas, chlorine gas, specifically targeting protected places according to the laws of armed conflict, such as hospitals, schools, etc., barrel bombs, torture, rape, all sorts of crimes that trying to push this agenda is problematic. And it kind of creates, in some ways, it actually creates more intervention from outside actors who look at it from a perspective of, okay, well, if you can't agree that, international law and crimes against humanity and war crimes to this degree should be resolved or handled, well, then maybe, it gives impetus for others to want to intervene.
Saeed, what do you make of that? Because, of course, there are two sides to every story, right? So there's also the side which says Assad is simply standing up for his country, et cetera, that he's trying to preserve the sovereignty of his country and, and probably in fashions that we wouldn't agree with, but either way, he's trying to somehow keep his country together and probably failing at it at some levels. But I mean, there are also the other side and the other side's atrocities as well, which are well documented. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's any party here which is completely really innocent, are there?
No, not at all. And I think along with that, Waqar, it's also a question about what is the efficacy of the Arab League. To go ahead and consider that this is going to be a way that they take care of their own, that is almost staging an intervention as though Bashar al-Assad is more guilty of substance abuse than of the crimes of against humanity for which he is alleged to have committed, would be ridiculous. What we have here, though, is, I think, an interesting overture that is being made to Syria to bring it back into the fold, as was said earlier, into the Arab League, that this is an Arab issue. And part of that is to essentially wean Syria, or at least try to cajole it away from as strong of an influence that Tehran has over it. It's important to recognize that Syria is only the third country to have been suspended from the Arab League for any measure of time, Egypt being the first one in 1979 for recognizing the State of Israel, and that was a decade-long suspension. Libya since 2011, and then here we have the case of Syria. But there's simply too many fissures within the Arab League. I mean, after all, here you have many countries in the GCC, a prickly session, even if Syria does make it back into the Arab League. Of course, at the same time, if there is then some kind of promise to provide much needed humanitarian support for Syria and for the plight of the refugees, then at least there could be some kind of guarded optimism for this particular move and gesture.
Optimism. I think that's a good point to end the conversation on. We really appreciate both Frank and Saeed for taking their time out this morning and for sharing their insight with us. Yes, Syria is, as we've spoken of here, quite a maze. Really, when it comes to figuring out how to resolve the situation, because there's so many actors with their hands in this pie and the pot that it's confusing to know how exactly one can work out who should walk away first, who should be held accountable in equal measure with other parties, because as we know, no party is really completely innocent. That's the honest truth, regardless of which side of this situation you find yourselves on. Now, is the way to have the Americans striking Syria? Is it the way to have the Israelis striking Syria too, mind you? They've done that quite a few times over these years since the crisis begun there. What messages are they sending then about sovereignty and or lack of sovereignty of Syria at this point in time within this crisis? Where does that leave, again, the Syrian people? Because at the end of the day, it's always about the people on the ground. And we always tend to forget that it's not just land, it's people and innocent people who are in the midst of all this, who are suffering. And all parties involved, both internally and externally, need to always keep that in mind. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar, Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to talk about a survey that has come out of Israel, speaking about Israeli Jewish youth and talking more specifically about ultra-Orthodox youth, pardon me, as well as, of course, a number of other Jewish youth, more specifically within Israeli society. Nearly half of religious youth and nearly a quarter of even secular Israeli Jewish youth support stripping the citizenship of Palestinian citizens of Israel. So these are not just Palestinians in the occupied territories who do not have Israeli citizenship, but these are the ones that in fact have Israeli citizenship, and these youth support the stripping of those Palestinians of their Israeli citizenship. There's also, hatred towards Arabs on the part of a lot of ultra-Orthodox youth. This survey was conducted by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Now, on top of that, there is also controversy in the United States among American Jews there about the Jewish National Fund, which is considering expanding its activities into the occupied West Bank. Now, all the peace organizations, the Jewish peace organizations, saying that this is not new news, in fact, that the Jewish National Fund has been doing this for a while now behind the scenes, but now it's just coming out in the open and wants to publicly support these sort of settlement activities, which, according to international law, are in fact illegal. And that is then creating a divide within the U.S. as well amongst Jews about, which direction really Israel is heading in, as well as what direction the Jewish National Fund, which claims to represent a lot of them, is heading in as well. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Laith Marouf, who's an award-winning multimedia producer and broadcasting law consultant. He's joining us today from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. Joining us from Tel Aviv is Hillel Schenker, who is a co-editor of the Palestine-Israel Journal. Hillel and Laith, thank you both for taking your time out to join us here in Scope today. Hillel, I'd like to start with you. Of course, surveys aren't always, a perfect view of any society and any populace, but I mean, this is disturbing, right? And it is fair to say, is it not, Hillel, that Israeli society is moving ever more right-wing in general?
There's no question that this is an extremely disturbing survey, and Israeli society has been moving to the right ever since the failure of Camp David 2000. And the Second Intifada, which was extremely violent and cost over 1,000 Israeli lives. At the same time, as long as the conflict continues, it is clear that there will be a growth of hatred and even this idea of removing Israeli citizenship from the 20% of the Israeli citizens who are Arabs, who are Palestinian Israelis. This will not happen. There's no question that no Israeli government, even a right-wing government, would even consider denying citizenship and denying the right to vote, particularly because of the desire to at least have a standing as a relatively democratic society within the international community. But it's very worrisome, no question about it. And as a matter of fact, at the Palestine-Israel Journal, our next issue will be devoted to the younger generation and how to confront this situation. There are young Israelis who are very much democratic and want peace, and the question is what strategies can be used in order to confront this.
So, Laith, is it a question of, do you think that as time goes by, there's sort of just desensitization to the entire issue of Palestinians? Is that what is happening?
Partially, it's definitely that, but the other part is the foundational myths of Zionism and apartheid Israel are rooted in Jewish white supremacy. And that means that in order for the children being raised in schools in apartheid Israel to stand by the choices of their state, they have to be indoctrinated with mythologies about, God-given right to the land and to ethnically cleanse it of its original inhabitants. So you have this problem of what is Zionism? What is apartheid Israel? And if the state of apartheid Israel doesn't indoctrinate its youth with these supremacist ideals, then it cannot coerce them into killing indigenous Palestinians, into ethnically cleansing them. So the problem is not just change of government or passing of time. It is at the core of the colonial project of apartheid Israel.
But then, Laith, if I may stick with you for a moment, I mean, I just wanted clarity for our viewers' sake as well. There are still quite a few within even Israel, right, who do want proper peace with Palestinians. You know what I mean? In the sense that how does one then address them and that number of people and their very genuine, desire for genuine peace with the Palestinians?
So unfortunately, even this group that we talk about in terms of those who are seeking peace with the Palestinians, the majority of them want a Jewish state in Israel, which means they are for the preserving of the Jewish privilege, of Jewish supremacy in what is the apartheid state of Israel. So that's the majority of those who talk about two-state or peace with the Palestinians. There's a very small minority that is religiously Orthodox Jews that believe in non-existence of the state of Israel. They deny it, they're against it. And there's even a smaller group of anti-Zionist Jews in Israel who believe in a secular democratic state for all the inhabitants of the land. And so that's where the problem lies. The problem lies with how can apartheid Israel, on the one hand, justify its existence as a state of the Jewish people, if there is such a thing, and at the same time claim to be a democratic or a secular state.
So Hillel, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. There is, right, this notion on the part of many that the two-state solution in and of itself is dead, and that we should in fact have a one-state solution where everybody, Palestinians and Jews, Christians, Muslims, Jews, all live in an equal state with equal rights. Is that the logical conclusion to this?
No, not necessarily. First of all, let me say I disagree with Laith. He seems to even suggest that there may not be a Jewish people. I and all of my friends and colleagues in the peace movement believe in the Jewish right to national self-determination alongside the equal Palestinian right to national self-determination. And actually, what we in Israel base our policies on are the original principles of the Declaration of Independence, which call for, yes, a Jewish state, not because it's a God-given state, but because it's the right of every nation to national self-determination. And also equal rights for the minority, the 20% who are Palestinians. So this is the idea, and on the Palestinian side, it would be Palestinian state with equal rights for the minorities as well. And matter of fact, they say they have a Jewish minority, which is the Samaritans. They consider them Jews. And so to answer the other comment, I don't think that the two-state solution is dead. I don't see the one-state solution as being realistic in any foreseeable future because the overwhelming majority of the Israeli Jews do not want a one-state solution. So therefore, the viable solution, and the Palestinians also want a state of their own, and a two-state solution is still possible because 80% of the settlers live only within about 4 to 5% alongside the green line, the official borders. And if we have a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders with a mutually agreed upon land swap of 4 to 5%, you would neutralize the problem of the settlers as well. So it is still possible. What is lacking is political will on the Israeli side. And obviously, on the Palestinian side, you have divisions which hopefully will be overcome between Fatah and Hamas. We have elections coming up, and I hope they will take place.
Hillel, if I may stick with you for a moment and just push you on that point. On the Israeli side, and of course we can talk about the Palestinian divisions, and that's a completely fair point to bring up, certainly. But on the Israeli side, if Israeli society is moving ever more right-wing, then that just by logic and reason means that Israeli leadership will be ever more right-wing as well. So then in such a case, are we being too optimistic then, that there's going to be hope that an Israeli leadership at any point in the near or foreseeable future will actually be willing to discuss peace?
No, I don't see an Israeli leadership ready to do that in the near future. However, we are facing a global situation of hyper-nationalistic, ethnocentric leaders, all of whom in their various societies are moving in a direction of hyper-nationalism. And now to counteract that, fortunately, President Trump was not reelected to a second term, and we have now a more democratic and more pro-peace two-state solution president in the United States, and we will not be able to move towards a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without major international involvement. And now there is a chance, once again, for multilateral action on the part of the international community to help bring the parties together. If that will take place, then the Israeli leadership will have to respond.
We're running out of time. Laith, I wanted to give you the final word. I know that you probably have a comeback for what Hillel there said, but I wanted to just move on, if you allow me, just for a moment, because it's also important to talk about American Jews and just Western Jews in general, right? So if we're talking about the Jewish National Fund, and for a number of years now, there has been a concern that American Jews are, for example, a lot more liberal in their leanings and do not always, or many times, in fact, do not agree with Israeli policies. And that sort of rift, do you think that that is significant and that is growing? Because, I mean, this Jewish National Fund story is just one example of that, but I mean, I'm sure there are a lot more out there.
Well, look, majority of Jewish people before the creation of apartheid Israel were anti-Zionist, and they were beaten down basically by the Zionists and kicked out of all the organizations within the United States and the West before the declaration of apartheid Israel as a state. And currently, it's the same situation. You have a generational gap between many of the Jewish youth in the West who have understood what it entails to have a Jewish state and the oppression that needs to be meted on the indigenous to guarantee that existence. And the problem now that lies in is that it doesn't matter really what the majority of not only Jews in the West, but not all of the population in the West who are currently anti-apartheid Israel, but it doesn't matter to those who are in power in the West, because imperial powers like the United States need the existence of apartheid Israel in order to control the most strategic geopolitical region in the world, West Asia and North Africa. And without the existence of apartheid Israel, the United States cannot project its power over the Arab people and cannot continue to fragment them. So here's the reality on the ground. The United States is not going to change anything. It's not going to pressure apartheid Israel to do anything. What will matter is the Palestinians taking their rights in their own hand.
All right, we'll have the final word, but we sincerely appreciate both Laith and Hillel for giving us their viewpoints on this issue. Certainly not an easy topic to talk about, but one that is important. I mean, as Hillel there said, it is disturbing to know that so many, even religious and secular youth within the Israeli Jewish society have these sorts of very, very right-wing views, stripping citizenship of the Palestinians, the 20% of the population of Israel who do have that sort of citizenship in their hands at this point. And then, ultra-Orthodox youth expressing hatred towards Arabs. What does this mean for two-state versus one-state? And then what does this also mean when it comes to the Jewish National Fund about Western Jews and their support or diminishing support possibly of Israeli policies? These are really important discussions, right? Because as time goes on, the positions are being hardened. And if we're going to have ever more right-wing leadership in Israel, it's really hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel here. And that's why I think it's important to talk about these things as much as we can, to have both sides air their opinions and to hopefully come to a resolution which is fair and just for both peoples. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar, Rizvi. In the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Guantanamo Bay. And for a while now, and for, at least back during the Obama era, there was talk of shutting down the Guantanamo Bay prison, right? Obama had said that he wanted to do so, but wasn't able to do so successfully. Biden has now said that he is reviewing that, i.e. his administration is reviewing essentially if he'll be able to do it either. And Guantanamo for a while now has been pretty much on the back burner, right? At the time that it was opened, and for a number of times over these years, there have been controversies about what's occurred there, vis-a-vis many of the men who are held there still not being actually charged with any crime, and some of them not, having a right to a lawyer, et cetera, et cetera. There have been a few military trials, of course, along the way, all of that because seemingly of the pressure, but there's also this huge political reality of no one wanting these men to be brought to the mainland, essentially, if I may term it that way, U.S., and to have them properly given justice or whatever is needed for them to have their human rights properly respected. A panel of UN rights experts has now told Joe Biden that, that he should address the human rights violations that have taken place against the prisoners, which, of course, as we know, include all methods of torture that can probably be discussed as well. We are now joined by Eugene R. Fidell, who is a senior research scholar at Yale Law School. He's joining us today from Stockbridge in Massachusetts. And we're joined from London today by Andy Worthington, who is a journalist. He's also the author of the Guantanamo Files and the co-founder of the Close Guantanamo campaign. Andy and Eugene, thank you both for taking your time out to discuss this with us today. Eugene, let me start with you, if I may. Human rights violations and Guantanamo, I mean, that's pretty much been synonymous, unfortunately, when we're discussing that. Will Biden, do you think, be the president to finally act on this?
I think he will. And I think whatever pressure can be brought is a good thing. But I think also people are leaning on an open door when it comes to the Obama administration. I mean, I think his heart is in the right place. He's got problems with Capitol Hill. As everybody knows, the Senate is split 50-50. There continues to be a substantial part of the American political world that wants to keep the Guantanamo detainees and military commission accused exactly where they are. In fact, there were people, including the past administration, disgraceful administration, that wanted to send more people to Guantanamo. But I think that we will see movement. I think there's never been a better opportunity. It's become completely preposterous. It's a very costly exercise in a time of austerity for the federal government. So I would be cautiously optimistic. In fact, more than cautiously optimistic. I think President Biden is personally committed to closing it. The question is how to do it. And he's an old hand at working Capitol Hill. So I think if there's ever been a president who could carry this off, it's him.
Andy, thoughts on that? I mean, for me, it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of the rest of the world has sort of moved on from Guantanamo, unfortunately, that we're sort of just used to it being there, and we're not really as worried about it anymore.
Well, I think people who care about human rights and the law around the world have not forgotten about Guantanamo. And I think the pressure points within the Biden administration are that there are people within that administration, just as there were within the Obama administration, who recognize that it is a fundamentally un-American way of doing things to hold people indefinitely without charge or trial. And the Biden administration will also be aware that the 20th anniversary of the opening of Guantanamo is coming up next January. And that will be noticed around the world. Journalists as well have a tendency to pick up on big dates like that. And I think it will be shameful to have to acknowledge to the world that the United States is holding people in what is essentially open-ended, arbitrary detention without charge or trial, and has been doing so for 20 years. So that's why I think that there definitely will be movement, and I'm broadly in agreement with everything that Eugene said.
Okay, so let's talk then about what kind of movement we may see. I mean, do you think that genuinely the lessons have been learned from Guantanamo can't even be called a mistake, right? I mean, it's a lot more than that. I mean, these are human beings we're talking about that were tortured and kept there for so long. I mean, do you think America has already learned the lessons that this must not happen again?
No, I don't think the country has learned that lesson. I think if and when there's movement on this, it will be because no purpose is served, no proper purpose is served by continuing this. I want to get a little granular here. First, I think it's important to distinguish between the people who are simply being detained at Guantanamo Bay and the handful, that's a very small number of people, it's a few dozen people. And the even smaller number of people who are currently pending trial before military commissions. Most of the people who have been at Guantanamo have never been on the charges. They've simply been detained. And I think with the passage of time, it's just increasingly difficult for Americans and for our legal system to tolerate the idea of a literally open-ended detention program, particularly, by the way, if and when there's a major shift in national policy in terms of our military presence in Afghanistan. I think if the book is closed or the page is turned on that, then it simply becomes more feasible to just wrap things up at Guantanamo instead of having this sort of Spandau prison in the Caribbean. Now, a word about how American institutions deal with this.
Sure.
Our Supreme Court some years ago came down with the serious case of Guantanamo fatigue. They just got tired of dealing year after year with major cases involving the legal landscape, and that is going to continue. On the other hand, there are continuing issues in the lower federal courts. There's an issue right now in the case of Mr. Al-Qahtani about whether he's entitled to a particular kind of mixed medical commission, and that's before the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit that's pending even as we speak. So there are things going on, but the broad policy question, I think the country's ready to bite the bullet on it. Among other things, it's costing the taxpayers a fortune to keep this facility going.
All right. So then, Andy, I would then think that it's overly optimistic then, right, for us to expect that the UN experts who said that Biden should review Guantanamo and address the human rights violations that have occurred there, for that to actually happen, because that, I would think, means accountability, and I would think that no one really is very willing to go back in time and to hold those people who were part of the torture program, and the fact that Guantanamo was even set up in the fashion it was. That, I mean, that's probably a very long list of very powerful men and women who would need to be held accountable. That's probably too far-fetched for us to expect.
I think accountability for, gross violations that take place, like Guantanamo, is something that it may take decades. I think in the end, there needs to be accountability for what happened. But in a practical sense, what we need to do now is all work together to find a way to actually close Guantanamo, to stop the abuses that are currently still happening, where people are held in arbitrary open-ended detention. So, Joe Biden has 6 men already approved for release, and he can set that in motion, releasing these men. That's the easiest thing for him to do. The issue of the men who are facing trials is one where the question is, should those trials take place at Guantanamo, or should these men be moved to federal court? But he has another group of men, it's actually 22 in total, who are called accurately the forever prisoners. These are men who have been reviewed many times and erring on the side of caution, which I think is really key to understanding the supposed intelligence regarding the Guantanamo prisoners. It's been decided over and over again that they're too dangerous to release. The review process is still in existence. It's called the periodic review boards. And I would very much hope that with the leadership of Joe Biden, these review boards, which consist of military and intelligence officials, are going to start approving prisoners for release so that we can whittle away at that number and really get down to just the small number, it's a dozen or so men that the United States claims it has a case against, and that we find a way to successfully prosecute them, and then bring this whole sorry story to an end. And then, of course, deal with it for as long as it takes with issues of accountability, because it needs to be made sure that something like this can never happen again.
Okay, Eugene, I'll give you the final word. Let both of you go. What do you think at the end of the day the legacy of Guantanamo will be? I mean, do you think it'll just go down in history and we'll all forget about it, or do you think, as Andy there said, that however long it takes, that there will be accountability at some point in time in the future?
Optimistic about accountability. The statute of limitations has run, or will soon run, on a number of offenses that were committed. I'm thinking here about torture. So, I think accountability has slipped away from us on that. It's completely outrageous. There were people who destroyed evidence. There were people who committed torture. We claim to forbid torture and criminalize it, but I'm afraid that some malefactors are going to escape justice. Long term, I'm afraid it will go down in American history as a relatively minor matter, forgotten by most people. We have a long memory, but we also tend to forget things. And I'm thinking about the Japanese internment during World War II. For many years, that was forgotten. And even now, for many Americans, tragically, it's a minor footnote in our history. So that's where we stand. I'm sorry to be less than thoroughly optimistic, but I think realism requires that.
Yes, indeed. It's well, we really appreciate Eugene and Andy for taking their time out of their no doubt busy schedules to share their insight with us. That was Eugene, who was speaking to us from Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and Andy was speaking to us from London, both of them sharing their expertise with us about Guantanamo Bay, the many human rights violations that have occurred there over the many years that it's been open, the fact that it was even set up in the fashion it was, the torture that occurred there. I mean, there's so many things to really discuss. Accountability really does seem, unfortunately, quite far-fetched at this time, but hopefully we can see that within our own lifetimes, hopefully, and these men who've been held there for so long, at least those ones who have not properly been charged and convicted of any crimes, that they can also see accountability for the years that they've lost without being held to account for any crime or any crime being proven in a court of law, that their lives somehow can, be given back to them vis-a-vis, some sort of compensation, which the U.S. really should be meting out to them for the unfair treatment that they have suffered. And of course, this, as Eugene there correctly said, this may be forgotten by Americans, but for the rest of the world, especially those men and their families, this will be something that they're going to remember for a very, very long time, for generations possibly as well. And that in and of itself hurts America also, regardless of whether Americans realize it or not. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.